Let's talk a little bit about the church modes in medieval Europe. Now understand that while ancient Greek musical notation had long since fallen out of fashion by this point, the culture and philosophy around music in ancient Greece would still loom large over medieval composers. And this was especially true in the writings of Boethius. So, an important component of curriculum for church musicians was to learn about the system of 8 modes, which were adapted from the 8 of the Byzantine chant, who, of course, got it from the Greeks. Now, each chant was assigned to a particular mode, and learning these modes made it easier to learn the chants and memorize them. So beginning in the late 8th century, books called tonaries grouped chants by mode. Characteristic melodic gestures associated with each mode also gave musicians a clear sense of mode. The modal system evolved gradually, and writers would differ in their approaches, of course, and in its complete form, which was solidified by the 10th century, the system encompassed 8 modes that were each given a number. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, and these modes had characteristics of final, range, and reciting tone. For right now, we're just going to focus on the final. So, what is a final? The final is the most important note in the mode, and the characteristics of this mode that make it that mode depend on the arrangement of tones and semitones around this final. In other words, this is basically where we start to see the development of the idea of the tonic. So, to make it simpler, the final was basically the medieval version of the tonic. And in the medieval European world, we had 4 finals, D, E, F, and G. And the tones and semitones would be arranged around these notes to give them the characteristic sound of each mode. And understand that it was the intervals and arrangements of intervals that gave them the characteristic sound, not the absolute pitch, because absolute pitch was not really a thing at this point. In other words, what you might see on the page as a D, the musicians might be singing something like G sharp. So for right now, I think that's a good stopping place, and we'll pick up next time. Alright, more on medieval music theory. Let's get into it. So previously I've talked about how there are 8 modes, and of these 8 modes, they each have a final, which is basically a tonic. And there are 4 finals. But here's the thing. How is it that we have 4 finals and 8 modes? Let's break this down. So, the odd-numbered modes are called authentic, and the even-numbered modes are called plagal. Authentic modes traditionally would range from 1 note below the final to an octave above the final, and the plagal modes would range from a 4th or 5th below the final to a 5th or 6th above the final. And the thing is, though, despite this distinction and characterization, authentic and plagal modes of the same final still use the same arrangements of whole steps and half steps. So then, why do we categorize them differently because of their range? So here's the thing. To our modern ears, Row, Row, Row Your Boat and Happy Birthday are both in the major mode. But to the medieval ear, the different ranges of these songs puts them into different modes. Now, later on, some medieval composers would start to put these modes into species of 4th and 5th, found with Cleonidas writings from ancient Greece. And the authentic modes would just be octave to octave, so 4th, then a 5th on top. Whereas the plagal modes would be about 4th or so below, let me check one more time, 4th below the final to a 5th above the final. And the authentic modes, with the species 4th and 5th, will be labeled as Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, and Mixolydian. And the plagals would be labeled as Hypodorian, Hypophrygian, Hypolydian, and Hypomixolydian. And this is, of course, coming from terminology of ancient Greece. Now, interestingly, while, yes, it is true that these Dorian, Lydian, Phrygian, and Mixolydian will correspond to what we can now consider Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, and Mixolydian, the thing is, the ancient Greeks did not think of Dorian as our Dorian because the labeling of these modes was a misreading of the well, not quite ancient, early medieval writer of Boethius. In other words, our labeling of modes was a huge mistake. Have fun with that. Like a fun with more. Alright, let's wrap up this little thing on medieval music theory. We've already talked about the final, which is basically a tonic. Now let's talk about the reciting tone, which is kind of like a dominant, though not exactly. And the reciting tone is the second most important note in a mode, and frequently these chants would hover around the reciting tone quite a lot before finally going back to the final. And in authentic modes, the reciting tone is always a fifth above the final, and then in the plagal modes, it is a third below the reciting tone of an authentic, unless it happens to land on B, in which it is moved up to C. Now, it is worth talking about why these modes were codified in the 10th century the way they were, and it was to help classify chants in liturgy books and other stuff. And, of course, chants that were developed and written prior to the codification of the modes in the 10th century do not really fit within any mode, whereas modes written after this time are going to establish the mode very early on. However, they didn't always stay within the prescribed range. In fact, many times would go as far as a ninth or a tenth higher, and they would also frequently substitute B flat in for B, because at the end of the day, these medieval composers, just like any other composer of any time period, did not write based on the oh so important rules of music theory. They wrote based on what they thought sounded good. Just a little food for thought. Now, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and follow for more music history videos like this, and I'll see you around next time.